Today's topic on the Psychedelic Mom is really supportive to anybody. We all experience stress, and we all need to learn how to manage our stress so that we live healthy lives. I don't know about you, but I feel like I have my own individual stress, but also it feels lately like there is this collective nervous system that we're attached to. And right now, I feel like it's a little heightened, that maybe we all need a hug or some breath practices or some practical advice and tools to create equilibrium. It's so important after stress to come back to a state of peace and safety. And I've been finding it a bit challenging myself lately. So I invited Dr. David Rabin on, and he's going to share with us some things about stress that I didn't know. Also about epigenetics, how we can truly rewire our systems. We talk about MDMA therapy and psychedelics and why they are so useful in rewiring our nervous systems. We also talk about a wearable device that he developed called Apollo. This is going to be a two-part series to talk about my experience with Apollo, whether I felt like it supported calming my nervous system. It's a fascinating new device. When he returns, we're going to talk about safety in relationships and how safety is so important to our sexuality and how this device and all the things that we talk about on this episode can really support our well-being. Welcome back to the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm here today with Dr. David Rabin. How are you?
Good, thanks, Michaela. How are you?
Good. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Have so much information for me today, personally. I feel like I'm someone who's always been pretty good at managing my nervous system and stress, but I've noticed lately it's a little hijacked. So I know you have 20 years of experience focusing on non-invasive therapies for chronic stress and its impact. And you're a board certified psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. And you also cross over in this area of using AI for managing mental health. You talk about psychedelics. So we've got a lot to talk about today, and also how trauma and these patterns affect our lives and our relationships, our sexuality, and maybe giving some actionable tools for people in the audience for what they can do, that we actually can manage our own nervous system. So why don't we start with 20 years of studying chronic stress and its impacts. What can you tell us about stress and what you've learned?
Sure, I think it's a great place to start. Stress is really interesting because there's a lot of misunderstanding about stress and what it is. One of the biggest misunderstandings is that stress is avoidable, and it's not actually avoidable. Stress is inevitable. It's just, how do we perceive it, and how does it shift the way that we make meaning of the world and ourselves? This has always fascinated me because, in addition to studying chronic stress, I also work with a lot of elite athletes and active and retired military and people who are really at the peak of their performance. And then also those who are at the rock bottom of their lives. And what's really interesting is that most people who are at either end of this spectrum, and of course, everyone in between, they all experience stress, but the way they respond to it is different. What it leads to is this understanding of stress as not just one thing, but two things, in that stress can be good stress that helps us to grow, which we call eustress, eustress. And then there's stress that makes us sick and stifles growth, which is called distress.
So why do you call it you, just out of curiosity? Is that relevant to something?
I think it comes from the Latin term for good, like euphoria.
Good. Okay. Yeah. Wow.
And yeah, I didn't coin that term, although I wish I could say I did. I think it really comes from the Latin root of goodness. And the idea being that the difference between whether we perceive a stress coming into our lives or generated by our minds as either eustress that promotes growth or distress that promotes illness and discomfort is our perspective. And how supported we are after or during the stressful event. So that's really critical for people to understand, and it's not well taught, even in Western medicine today. I think we often talk about stress as stress. It's like one thing, but it's not.
Right.
And if you look at people like the best athletes, the best musicians, the people who everybody looks up to in the world as the what we call the category of like the most elite
Right.
performers.
Mm-hmm.
And then we look at the people who are the most sick.
Mm.
A lot of the stressors they experience are actually the same.
Wow.
The difference is that people who experience stress and have adequate preparation, where the stress doesn't change or diminish the way we see ourselves and change how I see myself as a victim versus as a person who can overcome and grow, is very important. And it literally comes down to perspective, which is something that's based on how prepared we are for the stress going in, how recovered we are, how well slept we are, how self-confident we are, how we see stress as an opportunity for growth and change versus stress as a why me experience. And so the question becomes, leading
Right.
into stress and how we make meaning from it, that's most important is the questions we ask, which is, when stress comes, do we quickly ask, why me? Like, what's wrong with me that this is happening to me? Or is the question that we first ask, how can I learn and grow from this experience?
Yeah.
And that is the first step that determines whether a stress that's coming in is categorized in our brains and bodies as a eustress, good stress promoting growth, or a distress promoting illness and disease. So that's kind of where it starts. And then the second piece is, how supported are we during and after? Because if you experience a stress that we consider to be eustress or distress when we're having it, but then we have great support afterwards where people are not blaming us for what happened, they're there for us, supporting us, hearing us, then a distress can transmute into a eustress. But if you experience a very challenging event that you might categorize as good and growing, promoting growth, but then people tell you afterwards, why did you let that happen to you? Right? Which is something that
Right.
many people have done, even without realizing it. And it
Right.
is women are especially subject to this in sexual trauma. We see it all the time, that creates a victim mindset in the individual that literally takes whatever that stress was and transforms it into distress, because it makes it the fault of the individual, which is avoidable. So I think the good news about stress is all of our perspective on it and how we come out of it can change simply based on these two factors of how
Wow.
prepared we are and the way we think about stress going in and the way we understand it, and then how supported we are afterwards by our
So really
community.
like mindset and support.
Yeah.
And I heard you say, which I found fascinating, that the body can't tell the difference between physical stress, mental stress. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, it's true in that the nervous system
Right.
that we evolved for hundreds of millions of years, which was actually a big part of Dr. Eric Kandel's Nobel Prize winning research in
Mm-hmm.
2000, demonstrated that our stress response system in our bodies, in the way that it responds to fear and to potential threat and safety, it's nearly identical to the stress response system of ancient sea snails that are 300 million years old. And
Wow.
and so what that means is, 300 million years is like 295 million years older than humans are, right? Or maybe more than that,
Right.
299.5 million years older than humans are, because modern humans are only about 50,000 to 100,000 years old. And so when we think about that, it's really humbling,
Mm-hmm.
because it helps to explain what is hardwired in our bodies, what parts of our nervous system are immutable, unchangeable, and which parts of our bodies are changeable. And the parts that are changeable are perspective, support, preparation, mindset, right? The parts that are not changeable is how our nervous system is hardwired. So if you can understand that, then what that helps us to explain is that the response that happened in our bodies 50,000 years ago, when we were living in the prairies and the jungles and caves, when a predator was around the corner, that turns on our fight or flight threat or survival threat response, is exactly the same response that happens today from too many emails, too many pings, too many responsibilities, too much news, and general uncertainty and feeling out of control, our bodies respond the exact same way. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, respiratory breathing rate goes up, our thoughts speed up, we get tunnel vision, we narrow the window of awareness to just getting to safety. And all the blood flow that would go to recovery systems in our body, like sleep, digestion, immunity, reproduction, empathy, creativity, all those parts of our bodies that are not critical for survival get shut down and turned off or turned down temporarily to divert resources to the stress response threat survival system. And that times time, as you can imagine, depletes all of those critical recovery systems from getting resources they need to help us feel good and thrive. I hesitate to be too reductionist, but that is in large part how we see disease evolve in people, because if your body gets tricked into entering a survival fight or flight response just from emails or traffic or responsibilities or the news, then your body's taking resources from your recovery systems, your vagal, parasympathetic, rest and digest systems, the same way it would when there's a predator around the corner, except day after day, moment after moment.
So just chronic stress.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's coming up for me as a question as I'm listening is, okay, so our system is wired the exact same way as you were talking about to respond to email stress versus like a lion about to attack us. Okay. And then we're dealing with that every day. So I'm curious about epigenetics and trauma, whether you had trauma as a child or not, or whether you're just a person who didn't have that unique, hello, are you out there? Anyone that hasn't had any trauma? If you didn't have any trauma versus a child that's experienced trauma in, generalized trauma, would it still be the same because we're carrying that nervous system, as you're saying, from years ago? Or does epigenetics and trauma from the past seem to also play a role in stress response and patterns of thought?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's even more fascinating, which comes from Dr. Rachel Yehuda's work, starting probably around the 80s at Yale, which was really transformative for the way we look at trauma and stress, is that it's not just things that happen to us. It's things that happen to our parents and our grandparents that also matter. And epigenetics are really interesting because we talk about genetics in two ways, right? One way is genetics. What genetics implies in the DNA. DNA is the same in every cell in our bodies except our sperm and egg cells. Every other cell has exactly the same base code, which is really fascinating. That was what came out of Watson and Crick's discovery, who also, won the Nobel Prize. So every single cell in our bodies except sperm and egg has the same base code. That doesn't exactly explain the impact of the environment. It explains what was passed down to us from our parents. But if you look at the epigenetic code, which means epigenetic means like on the DNA. So there's another layer of code
layered on,
right? That's on the DNA that tells our DNA in each of our cells to react and respond differently. That's why our skin is skin and knows to be skin, and our brain knows to be brain, and our gut knows to be gut, because each of them have a different epigenetic layer that says, hey, in your skin, turn up skin proteins, turn down brain proteins and gut proteins, and then in your gut, turn up gut, turn down skin and brain, right? So that code is critical. Dr. Rachel Yehuda discovered that was really transformative is that trauma, past traumatic events that happen to an individual change the epigenetic code around stress response genes to turn up or turn down in their function. And this is really with respect to cortisol genes, is how she discovered this, and cortisol receptor genes. And the cortisol story, which is one of our major stress response hormones in the body, really helped to tell this story. And so what she discovered was that when we experience traumatic events, or maybe to put it in a more dramatic perspective, when our grandparents experienced a traumatic event, and she studied this in Holocaust survivors, that they experience epigenetic changes to their cortisol receptor genes. So their receptors are not functioning the way they're supposed to put it simply. And that those changes on the epigenetic layer can be passed down across generations for many generations. In animal models, it's now been replicated to show it's at least 4 generations of safe living after the traumatic event in the first parent generation,
Right.
4 generations of
Later.
safety to breed out the
Conditioning.
traumatic changes to the cortisol receptor. In humans, we don't have safe living,
No,
right?
it's like I'm just thinking like, what do you do? Go to a retreat center for 4 generations?
Right, exactly. Like, but then you come back and there's still stress, right? There's still challenge, there's still trauma. We're surrounded by it all the time. We don't have the benefit of cultivated lab grade safety. In humans, it's estimated that the effects of trauma on epigenetic expression of like cortisol receptors, for instance, could last for 10 plus
Right.
generations.
Are we basically saying like everybody has this in a way? Because there's every generation prior to us, our ancestors all had forms of trauma.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. One of the biggest misunderstandings about trauma, the first one is that trauma can't be labeled or diagnosed in the moment. It is only something you can look back on to understand that in a particular
Right.
challenge or hardship caused trauma, because trauma is not
Mhm.
the event.
Right.
Trauma is actually the response of the body to the event and what happens afterwards, add in support or
Right.
lack thereof, right? So it's what happens after in the body that is actually the trauma response that dictates whether an event was
Mhm.
traumatizing or not. It's not what happened in the moment. It's
In
not
the
the
event.
event itself. The second biggest misunderstanding is that trauma is irreversible in the body, right? And
Right.
so I think what we're showing and what we showed in our study in 2022, looking at MDMA assisted therapy and the impact that MDMA assisted therapy has on clinical symptoms of trauma is tremendous. It's like one of the most powerful treatments we've ever seen to actually clinically reverse symptoms of trauma and send people into remission when they've, been treatment resistant for over 17.6 years in those particular trials, and the effects are long lasting. And so why does that work? Well, if you look at their epigenetic code, which we published in 2022 for the first time, what you see is that the cortisol receptor epigenetic changes that are caused by trauma to make that receptor not function properly are actually starting to repair. And the
Wow.
amount of repair is directly proportionate to the amount of clinical improvement. So now we're starting to have biomarkers for the very first time
Right.
that actually demonstrate that trauma is reversible and reparable. And that
So
is the most
wild.
encouraging piece of the epigenetic story that we are starting to be able to talk about.
Yeah, that's absolutely so exciting. And to think that it's psychedelics and earth medicines that have the capacity to do this. I know you're talking about this one particular study with MDMA. For someone kind of visually to understand epigenetics, who's like, what does that even mean? Can you talk a little bit about that scientific study that was done where they gave this mouse who had never given children to smell cherry blossoms, and just to kind of visualize what that did to her offspring?
So there's been a number of studies in the last 20 years or so that have replicated Rachel Yehuda's findings in animal models in a causal way, because Rachel's findings initially were just correlative. So they were showing that if you were a Holocaust survivor who
Right.
experienced severe trauma, then your offspring were more likely for at least for like 2 generations to carry the same epigenetic changes to your cortisol receptors, and that those cortisol receptors changes on the
Mm,
epigenetic layer. So the code on top of the DNA that says, hey, turn cortisol receptor functioning up or down, predicts an increased likelihood of mental illness, especially
wow.
PTSD. So going back to your initial question that you asked a few minutes ago, what's really interesting about that and why it's such a revolutionary discovery is because we used to think it was genetic in your DNA that was giving you an increased or decreased likelihood of developing mental illness in response to stress. It turns out it's unlikely to
Wow.
be in the DNA that is the problem. It's actually on the DNA that's the problem. It's what's turning the
Right.
DNA up and down with
Wow.
respect to stress response genes. So the mouse studies and the rat studies you're talking about with the cherry blossoms and the food fear conditioning really looked at what happens when you expose one of these animals to a threatening stimulus like a shock or a cat or something like that, in association with something that should be pleasurable for them and safe like food or cherry blossoms. And what happens is the animal brain, just like humans, starts to condition what's called an associated or learned fear response. And that fear response then extends to whenever the animal is exposed to something that reminds it of that threat, like food, food should not induce a threat response. But
Right.
if food is always associated and paired with a threat response, then all of a sudden, every time the animal gets exposed to food, it recoils and goes to hide. And when you look at those animals, what's really interesting is that their cortisol receptors, the epigenetic code on their cortisol receptors, is changed very similar to the Holocaust survivors in very similar parts of the cortisol receptors. And so
Wow.
then they took those animals and they bred them down multiple generations. And what they see is those cortisol receptor changes on that epigenetic code continue. They continue
Right.
even though those animals in the subsequent generations aren't exposed to the same stress. They still fear the same
Right.
things.
So let's talk about biohacking this layer that now sits on top of the DNA, which is a new coding to turn up and down these stress responses. Let's talk about psychedelics first. Would you consider psychedelics a non-invasive tool?
So we call it interventional psychiatry. So it's certainly
Okay.
not non-invasive, but I would call
Okay.
it minimally invasive, because the way that psychedelics work to heal is they amplify the therapeutic process.
Right.
So we call it minimally invasive because it doesn't require dosing every day. It
Right.
requires just one to 12 doses of medicine over the course of 12 to 20 weeks. And that is way less invasive than having to take a medicine every single day of your life, right?
Right.
To keep your
Exactly.
symptoms away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about, first of all, how did you get into psychedelics and this study? And do you have any personal experience using psychedelics for rewiring your own layer on top of the DNA?
So I actually got into this as a naive scientist working with veterans and people with severe trauma, a lot of women who had experienced sexual trauma as my patients. And what became very clear to me, this is dating back to 2012, when I started to work with these patients much more frequently as doctors, especially doctor researchers, called physician scientists like I am, we're trained to detect patterns. Pattern recognition is one of our best skills. That's how we diagnose illness. Starting to detect patterns in my patients, I started to notice that, number one, almost all of my patients were veterans with severe PTSD, women with PTSD. They just never felt safe. They felt afraid all the time. And then when you look at what PTSD is a learned fear disorder. And animal studies have demonstrated this since Skinner, right? Like
Wow.
really, really long time ago, animal studies have demonstrated that trauma passed on over time, even within the same generation, is a learned fear disorder. And then how do they fix it in animals? They fix it by relearning safety, doing a reassociation of safety, which is called fear extinction training or fear extinction learning. And so what's really interesting about psychedelic medicine is that back in the 2012 through 2016 timeframe, there were some really interesting studies coming out looking at animal models of learned fear and trauma, and then looking at, well, we know that you can train these animals by associating the food with safety again to extinguish fear, but it takes a really long time. So maybe MDMA would accelerate that process. Maybe other psychedelics would accelerate that process. And I haven't seen a lot of studies with things other than MDMA, but there was a really critical study that came out. I want to say it was like 2016 or 2015, but looking at animal models of trauma in mice and showing that if you add MDMA into the fear extinction safety relearning process, it radically accelerates the extinction of fear
Wow.
and fear learning. And it does so in what's called a BDNF dependent pathway. BDNF is brain derived neurotrophic factor, which is
Hmm.
critical for relearning new things. And it's especially important in the
Whoa.
amygdala, where we learn fear and safety responses. And so when I saw that come out, I was already kind of seeing clinically with my patients, I was seeing
Right.
and watching people having these experiences and looking at the MAPS trials and seeing
Hmm.
the outcomes clinically. People are extinguishing their fear responses. That was clinically how MDMA appeared to be working with therapy. But when you start to look at the animal models, which are causal, right? They're
Right.
not correlative. They're not like looking at association. They're looking at, we cause trauma, then we introduce the safety relearning experience. What happens? What we see is that there is a BDNF dependent, so it's dependent on this molecule in this neurotransmitter existing and being secreted in the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, that helps to accelerate the relearning of safety. And the relearning of safety is dependent on that molecule. If you block that molecule in this particular part of the amygdala, the fear center, then the effects of MDMA on fear extinction are gone.
Wow.
Right? That's fascinating. And so that just continually reinforces this idea of safety being critical. And so I think what I want to bring people back to before we even get into psychedelics is the way to extinguish fear, learned fear, is to relearn safety. Relearning safety does not have to require psychedelics. It starts with intentional breathing. It starts with intentional touch, intentional listening, just somatic exercises that remind you what it feels like to be safe and trusting in your own body. And those techniques have existed for thousands of years. They're literally the foundation of every single Eastern and tribal medicine practice. We've lost a lot of that in Western medicine today. But if you go back even to Hippocrates and Maimonides, the forefathers of Western medicine, they also talked about the laying on of hands as being critical to the healing process, right?
So I'm excited about this. Yeah, before we get into psychedelics, these simple ways to biohack those fear responses when they're coming up. So you said breath. Someone might be like, oh, come on, breath. I know. But what's happening when we slow the breath down or do the longer exhale? What is happening in the body? Why is that so important? And what is it teaching us about touch? Is it turning on those hormones like oxytocin? Why are these so important to try before we even introduce a psychedelic?
We could get pretty deep in this, so feel free to interrupt me. So the main reason is because to go back to the ancient sea snail or the ancient mammal, long before humans, understanding Eric Kandel's work again, which is that the hard wiring of our nervous system is set up in such a way that when there's actually real survival threat around us, predators, lack of shelter, lack of food, lack of water, lack of air, those situations are what we evolved to trigger our threat response to help us survive and get to safety. Those are the normal things that are supposed to trigger our fight or flight system to turn on to get us to safety. What's interesting about that is that when you have that nervous system response of fight or flight in those situations, the critical 4 or 5 things that trigger you to enter a survival response, our bodies will shut down the opportunity to receive soothing touch as a priority. They'll shut down the opportunity to intentionally breathe. So one of the common misunderstandings about breath, and this is also in breath work and breathing, even in Western medicine, that's very poorly taught, is that your body just does it on its own and you don't need to think about it, which is true, but it's not the whole story. The whole story is that our bodies, yes, regulate breath and heart rate and blood pressure and all these great things on their own. But what we also have the capacity to do as humans is we can direct our attention to our breath and say, I am going to take an intentional deep breath right now and just focus my attention on the feeling of the air coming into my lungs and then leaving my lungs. And we can't do that when we're running from a lion. Like our bodies will not allow us. Like if you think about the hard wiring of the nervous system, this is why it's so hard to teach meditation to people who have PTSD, is that if you're not safe, if you perceive yourself to be under threat, our bodies, our nervous system, the biology will shut down the ability to focus on your breath because it deems that as irrelevant to immediate survival. Does that make sense?
It totally does. So what you're saying is there are certain people with complex PTSD or PTSD that are always in a state of stress. So to take a deep breath is like, no, that wouldn't be essential because I'm under threat.
Speaking.
Biologically,
the body opposes it. But the trick is that the body gets tricked, right? So people who have had PTSD learn fear after the actual threat is gone. For example, veterans who've experienced like war trauma, when they're back in civilian life, they're not experiencing war trauma anymore, but their biology might believe them to be. when
Right.
they're exposed to things that remind them of that war trauma. So the trick is, if they remind themselves to breathe intentionally, just by simply by just saying, I'm putting my attention on my breath and I'm going to choose to take a breath right now rather than letting my body just do it automatically. And your body allows you to do it, which, if you're not actually running from a predator or in a survival situation, it will every time allow you to do that. Then you're instantly, in that very moment, sending a signal to your emotional brain and your fear center that says, if I'm safe enough to pay attention to the feeling of the air coming in and out of my lungs, I can't possibly be running from a lion right now. And then, it reminds the brain, the fear center, that says, hey, you don't need to be blasting off, amygdala. You can just calm down, because I've proven to myself, by directing my attention to my breath or by receiving this hug and just feeling it, that I'm not running from a lion. And then it restores that sense of safety immediately. For some people, it can take 60 to 120 seconds. Hugs work instantly. Have you ever had a time where you're having a really crappy day, and then you get into your car or you go into some place, and then one of your favorite songs comes on and you're like instantly feeling
It's
better?
instant. Music is instant. Touch
Right.
is instant. Yeah.
Exactly.
Breath is instant too, but might take a little bit more. But yeah,
Yeah,
music.
breath is like not quite as instant as touch and sound, but it does work very quickly. And the reason why it works is because of this pathway that I'm describing, which is like what we call like a subconscious or a pre-conscious pathway. We're not even necessarily aware of what's happening when we get a hug and feel better instantly, or hear that song, or take those 5 deep breaths. But the reason why it works is because when we choose to do it, we're proving to our brains, the reptilian fear brain, that the snail
Response.
brain, right? We're
Right.
proving to that part of our brains, the hardwired part, that if we're safe enough to pay attention to this, we can't possibly be running from a lion or be in immediate danger.
Wow.
So that's how that works. But it is actually the understanding that making the choice to do it is critical, and that not just letting our bodies do what they've been programmed to do, it's actually
Okay.
making the choice.
Okay. So here in the psychedelic space, we talk about rewiring, right? And so what you were just talking about is a practice to use in the middle of a fight, flight, fawn, fear response. The breath, touch, music. Is that rewiring the brain like a psychedelic can, or just rewiring in that moment?
Yeah, no, it's rewiring your brain. Every opportunity to remind yourself that you're safe in a situation that used to feel like fear is rewiring your brain to associate that experience with safety rather than fear. Psychedelics don't work independently of that. They
Right.
amplify that.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
that's why Stan Grof describes psychedelics very accurately in the 1950s as non-specific amplifiers of awareness.
Yes.
They are not independently increasing safety. Can they
Right.
increase safety? Yes, but they can also increase fear, right?
It's true.
They increase non-specific learning. And
Right.
so if you understand that, then it helps to explain why it's not just taking a psychedelic at a rave heals your trauma. It's
No.
taking a psychedelic in the safe container of a psychotherapy
Setting.
experience with people who you
Mhm.
trust,
Mhm.
that love you unconditionally and are just there for you, not for
Right.
themselves, that results in activating the medicine in a way that boosts the activity and the safety response system of our bodies, that then says, oh, if I can choose to breathe right now, or I can choose to receive touch, or even touch myself, give myself a hug, or turn
Exactly.
on my Apollo and feel like the gentle, soothing vibrations
Right.
or music, then the medicine is amplifying the natural state of safety.
Right.
And so the goal of psychedelic therapy is not just to give
Mhm.
people a drug and let the drug do its thing, because that's not how it
Exactly.
works. It can also re-traumatize people by amplifying fear learning by accident, which happens
Right.
all the time.
All the
This is like
time.
50% of my clinical practice is helping people recover from accidentally re-traumatizing themselves with psychedelics. So the safety set and setting, and that
So important.
framework context of having a safe environment, and then you administer the drug, is
Right.
actually what allows the drug to have these outstanding, long-lasting benefits.
Definitely.
Because you're amplifying the relearning of safety and the safety circuitry in the brain. So to answer your question, doing these practices every day, every time you remember
Yes.
to do them, is rewiring your brain in and of itself. through association with safety rather than fear, add a psychedelic, sprinkle psychedelic medicine on there, that just
Right.
adds like fuel to the fire of
Hmm.
boosting the safety relearning process even faster.
Wow. So fascinating. I mean, so many things that you're saying, like, just correlate with experiences, not only that I've had or with clients and things like that. Even when you were talking about Holocaust and the epigenetics, having clients basically remember from the 1500s, going back and actually getting data of a memory that came up of a great grandmother back in time. But then also, I have this question about MDMA. There's also this feeling of love that the medicine can provide. I know for some people that's not always true. There can be shaking, there can be trauma response. We know that MDMA is an pathogen, opens up the heart, helps us feel compassion. What part is that playing in rewiring this stress response? Just that alone, whatever this medicine is doing, that piece alone?
It's hard to say because we don't have good comparative studies yet of people using MDMA alone versus using MDMA plus therapy. But what I can tell you is that people who go to dance parties a lot of the time or festivals and take MDMA recreationally often don't have these profound, long lasting trauma healing responses. They might feel all the things you just described in the moment and maybe
Right,
afterwards, but maybe they'll feel even more depressed afterwards, right? Which we also see
right, right.
because of lots of different reasons: taking too much, too frequently, not having support afterwards, not being able to integrate or unpack what they learned. And then the other piece is that psychologically, what's really interesting about how MDMA and psychedelics work is that they help us feel safe enough. In MDMA, I'll use in this particular example because of what you mentioned about amplifying kind of love and compassion, self-love and self-compassion and self-gratitude and these kinds of psychological concepts, is that MDMA in the therapy experience molecularly seems to be amplifying our sense of safety so much so that we feel safe enough to go back and remake meaning around past traumatic events. Reappraising meaning around past traumatic events and the impact that trauma had on us is a painful experience. Traumatic injury is like an emotional wound.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, like if you break your leg or get a really bad cut on your leg or arm and then you go into the ER, you can see the wound and
Right.
they would never not treat it. And the first thing that they do to facilitate the healing process is they open up the wound, they clean
Mhm.
it out, and then they sew
Mhm.
it up so that
Mhm.
you don't get an infection. And then what follows afterwards is actually quite painful.
Well,
That
it's interesting. I think even before they clean up the wound, which I'm thinking about, is they numb it a little bit so you're not feeling the pain, which I think goes back to even those stress responses. When you're in the middle of stress or when you're in the middle of the pain, your body can't feel safe to recover.
or it's harder for your body to feel safe enough to
Right.
recover. MDMA therapy is one example of the most well-studied psychedelic treatment for trauma, really seems to be working by basically helping you clean the wound, clean the emotional wound so
Right.
that it heals properly without a scar. If you just went into the ER with a cut on your leg and they just said, "Oh, sorry, we're not going to do anything about that because it's too expensive. Just take these painkillers and come back if you need us," almost everybody would develop an infection and potentially lose that limb or have severe complications afterwards. We would never do that. It would be unethical. And the reason
Right.
why it's unethical in medicine is because you can see the injury with your bare eyes. But
Right. Such a good point.
emotional wounds you
Yeah.
can't see.
No.
And so we deny them systematically. And so what that results in is the same response in the body as what happens outside the body, where you get an emotional wound. If that wound's not addressed, then that wound can become infected. That wound can become gangrenous and festering. And then you can literally amputate parts of your emotional body because it's
Right.
too painful to go back and reevaluate it.
Right.
So MDMA is like the surgeon in the ER when you come in that's going into your body I'm trained in MDMA and ketamine assisted therapy. I'm probably one of the few psychiatrists nationwide that's trained in both. But ketamine therapy works in a very similar way when we use it in the clinic, which is it helps people feel safe enough to go back and look at these emotional wounds from a slightly reduced pain perspective. Like the
Right.
safety helps them feel grounded and safe enough to know that they're not in the traumatic event again. They're able to just watch it from the outside from the perspective of safety. They can reevaluate the meaning they make around those events with respect to themselves and the way they see the world.
Yeah.
And that's what facilitates the healing, is the shift
Totally.
in meaning, right?
Definitely.
Then distress transmutes into eustress.
Definitely. Definitely. I don't really know anybody who's done MDMA therapy who didn't actually do work for months after, really, calls after doing somatic therapy, whatever, internal family systems or ACT therapy. So it's definitely important. Another thing that's coming, which is so interesting, is you were talking about breath, right? This is something we've known forever. Just like in psychedelics, these things have been used for centuries within indigenous cultures and probably all of our ancestors. Youth used to have these initiations, right? And I'm wondering how much our society would be helped by our youth having initiations with medicine that transitions the trauma up till that point, and then that they can move on. It's just kind of sad to me that in some ways we're not teaching mindfulness practices, breath practices to our youth, and then also how to use music to heal. The other thing that I've been concerned about, and I'm curious what you think about this, Dr. Gull Dolan's work with the octopus. And you just said what you see sometimes in your practice is people having more trauma after a psychedelic experience, right? Maybe it wasn't held well. Maybe they didn't have a good practitioner. There's many reasons, but they didn't feel safe. This window, this critical period for MDMA, they're saying that is open maybe 2 weeks after. For Iboga, it's a month. I mean, we don't really have the exact numbers. So if, let's say you have an MDMA experience and it was beautiful, right? And you had people around you holding you, and then you're doing your weekly integration calls, but you're actually not in a great place with your partner relationally, and there's something's going on at work too. What's happening when someone's having those experiences and coming back into ordinary life?
What would you guess is happening?
I just don't think it's good. I think it's a problem.
That's why the integration is so important. And that's why preparation is so important, is to prepare people not just for what they're going to experience in the psychedelic setting, but also afterwards. Because life is stressful. It's just the way it is, right?
Right.
So again, if stress is unavoidable, inevitable, it's going to be there. We need to be preparing people, which we do in our clinic and, in the MAPS trials, et cetera, to go back before they go in. Right. It's not just about preparing you for what you're about to experience. It's preparing you for what you're about to experience and then what you're going to experience after that when you leave.
Right.
And life is stressful. So when you go back and you've all of a sudden remade all this meaning around your past traumatic events and the impact they had on you and the way you see yourself from perspective of safety, one of the common experiences that people report is they feel more open. Your window of awareness widens and you become more sensitive to the world around you. One of the side effects, I hesitate to call it a side effect because it's actually a benefit, but the side effect of being more open when you go back to your regular life with all your day-to-day stressors, if you're unprepared, is that being more open emotionally makes you more emotionally labile. So you're more likely to bounce back and forth between extremes of emotion because you're more aware of the full emotional spectrum that you can experience.
Right.
If you don't have practices in place, like the breathing, the soothing touch, the intentional listening, you don't have grounding practices and healing practices that are non-psychedelically derived or non-psychedelic related in place before you enter the experience and you're going straight back to your regular stressful life, then when you go back to your regular stressful life, you are that much more likely to relapse because you don't have the toolbox available to you and practiced to bring back into your life to maintain your resilience and the benefits effectively that you've gained from the medicine. So that was one of the major inspirations for why we developed Apollo, because people need touch. Touch is one of the most therapeutic, soothing experiences we can have, but it often is stigmatized in society and requires somebody else to give it to you. So we figured out through my research at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and my work with MAP studying how MDMA works to amplify safety, that you can deliver touch to the body through technology using sound waves that you feel. And now we're using this tool before, during, and after ketamine experiences, and before, during, and after psilocybin experiences, and for
Wow.
integration after MDMA with MAPS. These tools are now ushering forth an opportunity to explore more deeply how technology can be used to amplify safety and healing.
So I
Yeah.
saw you're wearing one. I just ordered one this morning.
Oh,
Can you show your wearable and tell us a little bit about it?
this is
Yeah.
Apollo. It is a wearable that's about the size of an Apple Watch, and it delivers just gentle vibrations to your body. So if you have anybody who wants to feel this, we actually released a special feature for iPhone, where if you have an iPhone, you can just go to the App Store on your iPhone right now, type in Apollo Neuro, and you can
Okay.
download the app, and it will give you a demo experience of these vibrations, which are deep bass sound wave vibrations that
Wow.
they're music, but it's music that is composed based on the neuroscience of our touch receptor system. And you can feel it through your phone. When you feel it, you'll feel this slow wave going up and down. And that slow wave activates our touch receptors the same way that somebody giving you a soft caress would feel, or giving you a hug, or holding a pet, or a purring cat, or feeling ocean waves wash over you. Everybody has a different positive association.
Right.
But the point is, it's a hardwired system. So I don't know if you've ever seen The Matrix, or if your listeners have seen The
Yes.
Matrix, but one of my favorite lines in that movie is, there are certain rules that can be bent and there are others that can be broken. And by understanding the hardwiring of the nervous system, we can understand which rules can be bent, because many can't be broken. And the touch receptor system is one of those where, through augmentation with technology, we can actually bend the safety response system a little bit using vibration and sound, which is why music makes you feel good when you hear your favorite song on a bad day, to start to train your body to enter safety states again naturally.
Wow. And what has the response been?
Oh, the response has been great. We have hundreds of thousands of users that are happy users, along with thousands of people who have been using it in psychedelic experiences, because it's the only technology that augments or improves psychedelic experiences for people other than music. Music's been around for thousands of years. So it's really the first modern technology that you can literally just put onto your body or hold, that improves your sense of safety, just like your favorite song, but it's for your body. And so you don't need your ears to experience it. And people,
so you can just be sitting there in your car driving, and
that's one of the favorite use cases for a lot of our users, is
really
stuck in traffic. Yeah, I love it for that. But
can you feel it like right now?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it feels like a wave. It feels like a gentle wave, kind of like
And do you feel it through your body? Do you feel it just at the interesting?
Yeah, because what we discovered was, it was always known from ancient Eastern and tribal practices of studying breath, that if you breathe at 5 to 7 breaths per minute, that your body enters a safety state. So within like 90 seconds of doing a 5 to 7 breaths per minute exercise intentionally by choice, your body automatically enters a high HRV, high vagal tone recovery state within that same 90-second time frame in 95% of healthy people. And then biofeedback, which was discovered in the 1960s, proved that through Western science was true. It proved that breath work works, and why. And the reason why is because when you breathe at that rate, it induces a state of what's called coherence or resonance, harmony, to use a musical term, between the heart and lungs. And when the heart and lungs enter resonance, then they are functioning optimally and they're communicating safety to the emotional brain. And so what we discovered in my research, which was not known before, what was known was that breath work, as we talked about earlier, and meditation are really, really hard for people with PTSD and trauma, because they never feel safe. So what we discovered is simply by sending the right rhythm of breath to the body. The touch receptors recognize it. They send the signal to the emotional cortex. The body starts to breathe at the rhythm it's supposed to on its own. And that's Apollo.
That's amazing.
It's being used in lots of folks who are using psychedelics recreationally in tribal settings when they go to retreats, and then also in the clinical trials. So the response has been really good, and it's really encouraging to see, because given what happened with the FDA's disappointing vote on MDMA this year, which came as a real surprise to everybody who works in the field and sees how effective MDMA is and how much our patients with PTSD are suffering. The downside of the FDA's decision is that all those people who are hoping to get access to MDMA therapy are now going to the underground to get MDMA therapy from unlicensed, untrained providers, and get other psychedelic medicines from untrained providers, because I am not legally, and people like me who have a license, medical license, are not legally allowed to practice with these medicines. So who is legally allowed to practice with these medicines? It's untrained people who don't have a license to lose. When we see this expanding into the underground.
I think it is also both too, because it's a revolving door between MAPS and the underground. Psychologists and psychiatrists who for years, even back in the day, who risked their lives to serve these medicines because they believed in them so much. But yeah, you don't want people that are not trained to serve these medicines in any way.
And I just want to add one thing before we wrap, because you mentioned this indigenous idea of like the coming of age ceremony. And I've also worked with indigenous cultures, and I've seen the beauty and the success of those kinds of experiences. I think the challenge of integrating that fully into Western culture, where we start to say, oh, we should give psychedelics to our children, is very tricky, because in the indigenous culture, there's a framework for that.
Totally.
And in Western society, there is certainly not a framework for that.
No.
And so where the healing starts with our kids and teaching kids how to breathe and how to self-soothe and how to feel their feelings.
Yeah.
And our current society is actually very much about not feeling your feelings.
Right. Push them down, repress them. I'm so glad you said that. That was not a promotion for people to go out and give their youth psychedelics. I do think there's models like the Anti-Dynamite Church, but again, you're in a context of the community, the parents, all doing it together. We are not set up for that model in the West at all. And also say that even if you go to a ceremony and just because it's held by indigenous elders doesn't always make it safe either. So always do your research on where you go. And thank you so much for being here today. I feel like I could talk to you on all of these topics. I'd love to have you back after I get my device. And if you want to talk about relationships and sexuality and how all of this affects that.
Yeah, I would love that. That's one of my favorite topics, because safety is critical for intimacy.
Totally.
We don't really talk about that way, but especially in women have to feel safe to be vulnerable, to access and allow intimate states. So I would love to come back and talk to you about that.